Welcome back to No BS TS Series 2, Episode 4. And in this one, by viewer request, we are taking a look at the command pattern as well as the Memento pattern later on. So what are these patterns about? Well, the command pattern allows you to maintain a stack of commands that you apply to a state, and then you can do and undo them and manage that undo stack in an application. So if you're like, hey, how does this apply to the web? Well, it allows you to do cool things like time travel state management in something like the Redux dev tool. So it's really cool stuff. And of course, as we build applications with JavaScript and TypeScript using platforms like Electron, you can use it to manage an undo stack, which is really cool stuff. So without further ado, let's go first and take a look at the architecture of the command pattern. So we have over here the command stack. That is basically the one object that maintains the stack for us. Internally, it has a stack. Then you can execute and undo on it and get the current state. And when you execute, you give it a command. And that command has two methods on it. The first is to execute itself, and the second is to undo itself. All right, so let's jump over into our project and build that, and then bring up VS Code and start hacking on it. All right, I'm going to create an episode 4 directory, and then bring that up in VS Code. Of course, all this code is available to you on GitHub. All right, let's start off by creating a new basic directory. This is going to hold the basic implementation of the command pattern in two different varietals. We'll have the class version and the function version. Let's jump in there, and then I'm going to initialize a project. I'm going to add TypeScript and TS node. And then I'm going to initialize the TS config. And finally, I'm going to create a commands with classes file, because we'll start off doing the class-based implementation. All right, let's go over there and have a look. All right, cool. Nice empty file. And let's make this a little bit smaller so we can see stuff. So the first thing I want to do is define what a command is. So I'm going to create an abstract class that we then need to implement. We'll call it command. And it's going to take a state, right? Because we want this thing to be applicable to anything. And then it's going to have some functions. So in this case, execute and then undo. And each one of these is going to take a state and return a new state. And now let's start implementing that command stack. So I'll create a command stack class. Again, it's going to be generic. It's going to manage any kind of state that we want. And then internally, it's going to have a private stack of commands, and we'll implement that as an array. So it's going to be an array of commands, and we'll just keep that state generic propagating through that class so that it maintains a type-safe system. So now we've got to take the initial state. So I'm going to create a constructor, and it's going to have a private state value, which is going to be of that type of state. And that's going to be it for that implementation. We don't need any more. We're just going to have it automatically just go and store that off into that private state for us. And then we're going to have an accessor, so get state, and that's going to return that state value. So now we got our two things so far. We've got our stack of commands, and we've got the current state. Now we need to be able to execute and undo commands on that state. So next thing to do would be to create an execute method, and that's going to take a command that has to have that state as its type of state. And then I'm going to set the value of state to the return value from execute. So I'm going to say, hey, cool, this is the current state, so execute against that and give me back the new state. And then I'm going to take that command and I'm going to push it onto the stack. So it's going to become the last one on the stack. And undo basically just unwinds that. So I'm going to do undo here. It's not going to take any kind of command because it automatically knows that the command that we want to undo is the last command. So we are going to pop the command off the stack. And then if there is one, then we are going to set the state to the undo of that. So every command has to know both how to do and undo itself, which we'll see in just a second here as I implement our first command. So I'm going to create a new command called add1, and it's going to extend a command, and the type that we're going to operate on is a number. And can you guess what we're going to do when we execute? Well, we're going to add 1. So we're going to take the state, and we're going to return the state plus 1. And then when we undo that, we're going to return the state -1. How cool is that? All right, so let's go and create a state stack of numbers by grabbing command stack over here. And down here, I'll create a command stack with a new command stack of numbers starting at 0. And then I'll execute on that, add 1, and I'll do a console log with that state. And let's also do that before, right? So we want to verify that we start off with 0, and then we expect to get 1 because we're going to add 1 to that state, and then we're going to get 1 there. So let's take a look and see how we do. Clear that out, npx ts node, and then commands with classes. Hey, all right, 0, and then 1, as we'd expect. All right, that's looking good, but now we need to figure out if we can undo, right? So let's do cs undo, and let's see what happens when we undo the add of 1. So that should take it back to 0, which was the starting point. So let's try it again. There you go, 0, 1, 0. Awesome, very cool. Okay, so now let's try it out with something like a subtract, right? So same kind of idea, but in this case, we're going to say subtract 1, and we're going to subtract 1 from the state on the execute, and then we're going to add 1 on the undo because that undoes a minus. So let's try that again. Let's execute now the subtract 1. And this should give us -1, right? Because we're at 0 currently. So let's try that. Very cool. Okay, 0, 1, 0, -1. Awesome. And let's undo that again. Let's get back to 0 again. So I guess we're kind of bobbling around 0 here. Yep, perfect. So now we've got 0, 1 as we add it, and then back to 0. And when we undo it, and then we subtract, and then we undo the subtraction. Not bad. Okay, cool. So let's try one more thing. Let's have a set value. So sometimes you're just setting a value to a discrete value. You're not actually setting it relative to the current state. So I'm going to do set value here, and it's going to extend a number just like before. And I'm going to create a constructor that takes the value that we want. So this is just going to be the value that we want the state to be once it's executed. And of course, we have to call a superclass. And here we're just going to return this .value. Now, when we're asked to undo, what are we going to do here? Because the current state will be whatever this value is, and we haven't retained the current value. So what we need to do is retain the original value. So I'm going to go and create a new private here. We'll call it original value, and it's going to be a number. And then we're just going to save off that state right there. And then when we are asked to undo, we just return it. And TypeScript is now complaining that that could be undefined, which is true. So I'm just going to add an exclamation point and say, we know it's a number. So, okay, let's try this out. Let's set a value. And then set it to 42. Of course, got to do that. And then we'll undo it. And so we should see it going from 42 and then back to 0 again, just as we had before. So kind of bouncing around 0 as we have. There we go. Okay, cool. Nice. All right. And I leave it to you to kind of create a very long stack and try that out. So let's go and try this again, but use functions instead of classes to execute on this. So I'm going to create another file in here. We'll call this commands with functions and paste in our implementation of it as a class because we're going to be strongly deriving off of this. And so my thought around command is I don't want to replace that with a function. So let's start off with a function. And again, we'll say it's a state. And that function is going to take a state. And then it's going to return an array. And that array would be of the type state for the first value, and then the undo function. So that's going to have that same signature here as the undo. So I'm going to return to you both the new value that I want you to have, but also a function that you can call if you want to then undo that command. All right, so that gets rid of this command. So the next thing I want to do is turn this command stack class into a create command class function. So let's start off with a function, and we'll call this create command stack. And it is going to, again, manage a state. And so we'll start off with that initial state. And then internally, we're going to have that stack. And we're going to copy that state. So we'll have state equals that current value of state. And then we're just going to return an object that has execute and undo on it. So now every time we call a command execute, right, we get back a tuple. So we need to crack that open. I'm going to say we have a new state coming in, and we have the undo function. And so I'm going to set the state to that new state. I'm going to pass that function the state. And I'm going to return the state. So the output of execute is the new state. And then onto that stack, we're going to push that undo function. And that's going to be a type of command function. So that's why it's giving us that squirrelies there. And it's just a function, so it's not command.execute. All right, it's starting to look good here. Cool. And it looks like one last thing. Our stack is not a stack of commands. It's a stack of undos. So what is a signature of an undo? Well, it's a function that takes a state and returns a state. So really it's just, in this case, that as an array. All right, so let's fix up undo here. So we're gonna pop that stack. That's great. And then we're just gonna run that command on the state. Get that state in both spots. Cool. And return that state, and seems like we're good. All right, so now I'm gonna actually start from scratch on this one. And I'm gonna create a new command function, and we're gonna call it add1, and we're going to give it the type of a command function. So it's going to then return an array, and that's going to be the state plus 1, and it's going to have a function that undoes it by doing state minus 1. Pretty simple. So let's go and create our command stack. We'll call it cstack, and say create command stack and give it 0, so that's going to give it its number. And then I'm going to output, because the returned value from execute is the new state, the execute of add1. So hopefully that should be 1, and then we'll undo it, and that'll give us 0. So let's try this out. There we go, 1 and 0. Pretty cool. All right, not bad. So a little bit of an interesting route to create this command stack function, but turns out it looks okay. Great. So let's do subtract 1. I actually think this is actually doing pretty well here. So subtract 1, and we'll subtract 1, and then we'll add 1. We'll try that. I think it should work. I have faith. I have confidence. See, subtract 1, and then undo. Let's give that a go. So yeah, so same kind of idea. 1, 0, negative 1, 0. Awesome, cool. So now we've got do and undo working. And of course, let's try out a setting of a discrete value. So we're going to have some state that we want to apply as a fixed value as opposed to a relative value. But in this case, well, we're going to have to do like the same sort of thing we did before. We're going to have to have essentially like a creator. So we're going to have a functor, a function that creates one of these command functions. So I'm going to create a function called create set value, and it's going to take a value that is a number, and it's going to return one of these command functions. So let's specify that as the output type, just so we make sure that we're doing it right. And now we're going to return a function that takes a state. And what is it going to do with that state? Well, it needs to cache it off, because when we undo it, we basically want to return the existing state. So let's do original state and just get that value stored. And now we're going to return the value. And if we're asked to undo, then we just return that initial state that we had stored off. Pretty cool. Okay, great. So let's do create set value there. So let's call that create set value to create one called like set to 42 as an example. And we'll do create set value, and then we're going to execute that set to 42 on our stack and see what happens. There you go. Cool. 42 and then 0. Nice. All right. So maintaining an undo function is actually kind of a pain, right? It's very easy to do. It's a little bit less easy to undo. So is there a way that we can basically roll the undo functionality right into the system so that we don't ever have to implement an undo? Well, absolutely. There is another pattern called the Memento pattern that allows you to basically store or freeze the current state of an object and then hold that. And so what we can do is essentially have a stack of mementos of the state. And when we're asked to undo, we just pop it off and set the value to that state. So here's what that pattern looks like. We have essentially the same API on the command stack side, but instead of storing the list of commands, we instead store the list of mementos, and that makes the commands all that much easier. So let's go off and try this out in a new directory called Memento. All right, so I'm going to go bring up the terminal, and I'm going to go back a directory, and I'm going to copy all of that basic into Memento, because it's going to be really closely related. And then I'm going to go into that Memento, and we'll start hacking around, and we'll see what we need to change to follow the Memento pattern. So let's start off with the class variant first. And the cool thing here is we no longer need to have undo. All we're going to have is execute. It's really great. So let's go and just first off change a bunch of our commands to make them that much easier. No undo for you. No undo for you. We don't need the original value. We don't need to store the original value. We don't need undo. Awesome. Cool. And now it's really just a question of how we want to manage this command stack here. And in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to use JSON stringify as our memento system. So JSON stringify takes any object or array or basic value and turns it into text for us. Now there's some limitations here. JSON stringify doesn't handle dates well as certain types like map and set. But for simple cases like this, it will do just fine. If you do have dates or you have more complex state, you can use something like Lodash's deep clone to give you clones of the state instead of using strings like this. But this is just a little bit more efficient. In fact, it's about twice the speed of doing it with deep clone. So I'm going to do a string array here. And the first thing I'm going to do is push onto that stack that JSON stringified state. And then to get the state, all I need to do is parse the last item on the stack. So that would be the stack length -1, because we're always going to have 1. We're going to maintain that, so we always have 1. Okay, so now since the since this command returns the state, we're just going to get that JSON stringified state off of stringifying the executed command. And we'll pass it this.state, and that's going to unpack the existing one. So that's actually pretty nice. We're going to basically reuse this. And then we'll take that string state and push it onto the stack. Pretty cool. And now down here in the undo, all we basically got to say is, well, if we don't ever want to get rid of that first item, so if the stack length is greater than 1, then it'll pop. Otherwise, you can just hit undo, undo, undo all the way at the end there, and that's no problem. All right, so here we go. If this stack length is greater than 1, then we pop. Cool. All right, let's go down here and see how we're doing. Okay, looking pretty good. I'm not seeing any TypeScript errors. All right, let's try it out. Let's run commands of classes, and it looks to be good. Cool. So much easier interface here now that we're basically frosting that state. And of course, you can use JSON stringify if you want to, or you can use something like deep clone if you actually want to keep full copies of the state as you go through the system. And obviously there are some memory limitations here. So some interesting performance trade-offs as you build out your command system like this. Okay, let's try it out with our functions. So let's bring over here the functions side of it. And again, this is going to be much easier. So we're just going to return a new state. How easy is that? That's beautiful. All we have is a state coming in and a state going out. Pretty easy. Okay. So this one is just going to be a string array, just like we had before. And we will start it off with a stringified state. Pretty easy. So to get the current state, which we need to pass to the command, we need to do that JSON parse of the last item on the line with that stack. And then we are going to get the new state by calling that command on the current state. And we're going to return that. But we're also going to push onto that stack that JSON stringified new state. And then down in here, we'll do that pop thing. So we make sure that we have enough length in our stack before we pop it. And then we just return the current state at the end of the stack. Pretty cool. Okay. So now all of these ones get so much easier. Okay, let's get rid of that. Don't need that anymore. That's just state is state plus 1. Cool. This one is just state minus 1. Nice. And then this is just ridiculously easy. We're just going to return a function that does state value like that. In fact, just return the value. Hey, how easy is that? Cool. I can't believe create set value got even easier. That's awesome. Okay, let's give it a try. So go back in here, npx node, and then we'll do commands with functions. And away we go, looking great. All right, so pretty simple execution of the command pattern using the Memento pattern. All right, well, let's try this out in the context of a React app by creating our own custom hook called useStateWithToDo. First thing I'm going to do is go back a directory, and then I'm going to use yarn create React app. I'm going to call this to-dos with undo, and then give it a template of TypeScript. All right, let's jump in there and then start it up. Looking pretty good as per usual. Okay, let's jump back over into here, and I'm going to copy this commands with functions because this is what we're going to use to maintain our state. We're going to do the Memento pattern. It's just that much easier. And I'm going to bring up the sidebar, and we're going to go into the source directory. So I'm going to create that hook, useStateWithUndo. And the first thing I'm going to do is bring in our code. I'm obviously not going to do any of that fun testing stuff, but this will work just fine. And then I'm going to go and export a function, call that useStateWithUndo. And it's going to take a data type. And we're going to have some initial state of that data type. And the output of this is going to be a tuple, just like you would with useState. So the first thing is going to be that data type. That's going to be the value, the current value. And there's going to be two functions. So that first one is going to take the current state, which is the data type, and it's going to return a void because that's like set value, right? We're just going to set the value. And then the other one, the undo, is not going to take anything at all. It's just going to be a function that takes nothing and returns a void. That's going to be the undo. So this has almost exactly the same signature as useState. It just has that additional last parameter, which is the undo function. So it's got a value, a set value, and an undo. So the first thing we need to do is have some states. We're going to bring in useState from React. And now we're going to use that. So I'm going to have state and then set state, which is going to be that initial state of that data type. Cool. And then so that gives us our first return value. So that's just state. And now we need our command stack. So for that, I'm going to use a ref. So let's bring in useRef. And then I'll create a new value here called stack. And so that we have a useRef where we call that create command stack and we give it the current state. So we're going to start off with the initial state over here. So we got our stack. So now we need to return those two functions. We need to return set value and we need to return that undo. So to do that, I want to do it nicely. So I'm going to use useCallback. So we're going to return a useCallback here where we take a value, which is going to be of that data type. And we're going to get a new state from our stack because we're going to call execute on it. And all we're going to do there is just give it that value. We're going to say, okay, that's the most recent value. Cool, good to go. And then we're going to set the state to that new state. And then in terms of a dependency array, we don't have any dependencies. Now for the use callback, it's a little bit simpler. So in this case, we are just going to call undo. And then again, set that state. So we're just going to do undo here. And now we've got our hook. So let's start using it. Let's go over here to app.tsx. And then I'll start trimming this down. So I'll go and get rid of the logo and the CSS and all this header and all that stuff. Yay, goodbye. And I'm going to bring in that useStateWithUndo. And then I'm going to define what a to-do looks like. So it's going to have an ID, a text, and done. Pretty simple to-do structure. And then I'm going to call our useStateWithUndo. So that's going to give us our list of to-dos, our set to-dos, and then our undo. And then with that list of to-dos, I'm going to iterate over those and create a list of their labels and also have some checkboxes on them where they can set whether they're done or undone. Now, obviously, we need to be able to add one. So let's add a little UI for that. And down here, we're going to have a text input, which is going to have a ref on it. So we need to bring in useRef over here at the top. And then we'll set that ref. Cool. And then when the button, the add button is clicked, we're just going to do what we normally do, right? We set to-dos. We give it the array that is currently there. We just add one onto it, So it's got the ID, it's got the length of the array, +1. It's got the current value, and then the done. Cool. So let's go try this out. Let's go see how this looks in the browser. All right, cool. We got an ad. Hello. Cool. And we can even change it. That's great. Nice. But let's try it out and see if we can actually undo. So let's add one more button down here and give it the undo button, which would then call that undo callback. So let's go over here. I'm going to refresh to start from scratch. So we'll call this 1, and then 2, and then undo. How cool is that? An undo stack just like that. And we haven't had to go and manage all that undo logic because of Memento, very, very clean. All right, well, I hope you enjoyed this look at how you can use the command and Memento patterns together, and even in the context of React. It's really cool stuff, and that's what NoBS TS Series 2 design patterns is all about. And of course, you might want to check out the NoBS TS book that's on sale now. It's great stuff, and it covers all of Series 1 and all the videos in there, and all of Series 2. And every time a new one of these videos comes out, you will get a chapter before you even see the video, and you'll have both the text chapter and the video to try out. It's fun stuff. Of course, in the meantime, if you like the video, just hit that like button. And if you really like the video, hit the subscribe button, and you'll be notified the next time one of these NoBS TS or any blue collar coder video comes out.